The morning sun cast long shadows across the South China Sea as Rachel Winters adjusted her boat's heading with practiced precision. To any casual observer, she appeared to be just another solo sailor enjoying the calm water's athletic build, weather-appropriate gear, and the quiet confidence of someone who belonged on the ocean. Nothing about her suggested she was anything more than an experienced maritime enthusiast taking advantage of perfect sailing conditions. But appearances could be deceiving. Rachel's vessel, christened the Meridian, cut through the water with a purpose that contradicted its leisurely pace. The boat itself looked expensive, but not unusual, the kind of craft owned by successful professionals who could afford quality equipment. What wasn't immediately visible were the subtle modifications hidden beneath its civilian appearance. Reinforced hull sections disguised as decorative elements, communication arrays camouflaged as standard marine equipment, and navigation systems that operated on frequencies most sailors would never encounter. She checked her position against both standard charts and a secondary system that hummed quietly below deck. The custom satellite network provided real-time intelligence updates that would have impressed even the most sophisticated naval operations. Rachel was exactly where she needed to be, drifting purposefully toward the edge of a contested maritime boundary that had been the source of increasing tension between multiple nations. The salt-streaked blonde hair that escaped from beneath her cap caught the morning breeze as she scanned the horizon methodically. Her weathered hand spoke of years spent on various vessels, though her actual age remained difficult to determine. She could have been anywhere from her late 30s to early 50s, carrying both youthful energy and the weight of accumulated experience that came from a life lived on the edge of dangerous situations. A soft chime from her navigation system indicated an approaching vessel. Rachel glanced up without surprise to see a naval patrol ship adjusting course to intercept her position. She had been expecting company for the better part of an hour, and her intelligence suggested this would be the USS Hampton, a destroyer-class vessel with a reputation for aggressive enforcement of territorial boundaries. She continued her methodical adjustments to her instruments, maintaining the appearance of a civilian sailor focused on her own business. The approaching ship represented exactly the kind of encounter she had been hoping to provoke, a test of systems and protocols that needed evaluation under real-world conditions. On the Hampton's bridge, Lieutenant Commander Marcus Blake observed the civilian vessel through high-power binoculars. His expression tightened with concern as he noted the boat's heading and speed. The lone sailor appeared to be maintaining course directly toward restricted waters, seemingly oblivious to the danger she was placing herself in. "She's still heading for the exclusion zone," Blake commented to his executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Kevin Price. Price's posture was rigid, his uniform perfectly pressed, and everything about his bearing spoke to ambition carefully controlled by strict adherence to military protocol. He had been pushing for more aggressive enforcement of maritime boundaries, arguing that civilian vessels needed to understand the seriousness of territorial violations in increasingly tense waters. "Civilian vessel on bearing 140. Blake spoke into the radio with professional courtesy. "This is the USS Hampton. You are approaching restricted waters. Please alter your course immediately to avoid entering the exclusion zone." Through the binoculars, they watched as Rachel acknowledged with a polite wave, her body language suggesting she had received and understood the message. However, her boat continued on its original heading without any noticeable course correction. "She's acknowledging but not complying," Price noted, a hint of irritation creeping into his voice. "Probably another environmental activist testing our resolve. We've seen an increase in these deliberate provocations over the past few months." Blake studied the woman through his binoculars more carefully. Something about her didn't fit the typical profile of boundary-pushing activists or tourists who accidentally strayed into restricted areas. The boat was too sophisticated, too well-maintained, and the woman herself moved with a deliberate precision that suggested professional training rather than recreational sailing experience. Issue another warning, Blake decided, though doubt was beginning to edge into his voice. There was something about this encounter that felt different from the usual territorial violations they dealt with. Price took the radio with obvious satisfaction. "Civilian vessel, this is the USS Hampton. You are entering restricted waters. Change course immediately, or we will be forced to take defensive action to protect this maritime boundary." Rachel's response was visible through their binoculars, a pleasant, non-committal gesture that could have been interpreted as acknowledgement, though her vessel maintained its steady approach toward the restricted zone. Her calm demeanor was beginning to unnerve Blake, who had dealt with hundreds of similar situations but never encountered someone who seemed so deliberately unconcerned about the serious warnings being issued. "Sir," Price said, turning to Blake with growing intensity, "regulations are clear about unauthorized vessels in restricted waters. With Chinese naval activity increasing in this region, she could be conducting intelligence-gathering operations. We can't afford to let civilian vessels probe our response protocols." Blake continued studying the woman through his binoculars. Her movements were too precise, too confident for someone who was simply lost or confused. The way she handled her vessel suggested extensive maritime experience, possibly even military training. But her apparent disregard for their warnings was either incredibly reckless or part of some larger plan he couldn't yet understand. "Final warning," Blake decided, taking the radio himself. "Civilian vessel, this is your final warning from the USS Hampton. Alter course immediately, or we will be forced to fire warning shots to enforce this maritime boundary." Aboard the Meridian, Rachel received the message with the same calm demeanor she had maintained throughout the encounter. She checked her watch, then consulted a series of readings on specialized equipment that was carefully concealed within her navigation console. Everything was proceeding exactly according to the schedule she had been following. She made a minor adjustment to her heading, not enough to take her away from the restricted waters, but sufficient to be noticeable to the observers on the Hampton. The slight course change was calculated to appear cooperative while continuing to test the naval vessel's response protocols. Back on the Hampton's bridge, Price observed the minimal heading change with growing frustration. "She's playing games with us, sir," making tiny adjustments to appear cooperative while continuing her approach. "This is exactly the kind of provocation we need to respond to decisively." Blake hesitated, weighing his options carefully. The situation was escalating beyond routine territorial enforcement, but something about the woman's behavior continued to trouble him. Professional sailors didn't typically ignore naval warnings unless they had specific reasons for their actions, reasons that might not be immediately apparent to the enforcing vessel. "Prepare to fire a warning shot," Blake ordered reluctantly. "Standard distance protocol. Make sure it's well clear of the vessel but close enough to demonstrate our seriousness about territorial boundaries." "Yes, sir," Price responded, unable to hide his satisfaction at finally being authorized to take decisive action. He relayed the orders to the weapons station with obvious enthusiasm for what he saw as appropriate enforcement of maritime security. The warning shot cracked across the water with authority, but something went catastrophically wrong. Instead of splashing harmlessly beside the Meridian at a safe distance, the shell struck the boat's hull near the waterline. Water immediately began seeping through the damaged section, creating a genuine emergency situation that had never been intended. "What happened?" Blake demanded, grabbing his binoculars to assess the damage they had inadvertently caused. That shot was supposed to be clear of the target vessel. "Sir, sea conditions must have affected the trajectory," Price offered quickly, though uncertainty was evident in his voice. The targeting calculations were correct according to standard protocols. Blake watched through his binoculars as water began entering the damaged civilian vessel, expecting to see immediate signs of panic or distress. Any reasonable person would be calling for help, activating emergency beacons, or at minimum showing visible signs of alarm at their suddenly compromised situation. Instead, Rachel calmly walked into her cabin and retrieved a device unlike any standard emergency communication equipment. The satellite phone was sleek, unmarked, and clearly designed for purposes beyond typical maritime safety protocols. She made a single call, speaking only 6 words that would change everything for everyone involved. Nightingale. South China Sea. Blake. Confirmed. Price watched through binoculars as the woman completed her mysterious call with the same unnaturally calm demeanor she had maintained throughout their encounter. "Who's she calling?" he asked with obvious skepticism. "Her insurance company?" Blake didn't respond immediately. Something about the woman's reaction was sending warning signals through his experienced military instincts. Her complete lack of panic or even concern about her damaged vessel was unlike anything he had encountered in years of maritime operations. Professional sailors might stay calm under pressure, but this was something different entirely. The implications of what they had just done were beginning to settle over the bridge crew like a heavy fog, though none of them yet understood exactly what they had stumbled into. "Sir," one of the junior communications officers called from his station, his voice tight with confusion. "We're detecting unusual activity on our secured channels. Something's bypassing our encryption protocols." Blake turned sharply from his position at the bridge windows. "What do you mean bypassing? Be specific about what you're observing." "I'm not entirely sure, sir. It appears our communication systems are being accessed remotely. We're receiving direct transmissions on frequencies that should be impossible for civilian equipment to reach." Before Blake could respond, every communication system on the Hampton began malfunctioning simultaneously. Screens flickered between normal operations and error messages. Encryption protocols failed without explanation, and a digitally altered voice emerged from speakers throughout the bridge. "USS Hampton, this is Strategic Command Override Protocol 7. You have engaged a Phantom-class asset. Authentication code November Echo Mike Echo Sierra India Sierra." The bridge fell into stunned silence. Every officer stared at the communication equipment, then at each other, as the implications of what they were hearing began to register. Price turned to Blake with obvious confusion written across his face. "Sir, what is this? Some kind of electronic warfare exercise we weren't briefed about?" The color had drained from Blake's face as recognition dawned. He remembered fragments of a classified briefing he had received when taking command something about obscure protocols that he had been told would likely never apply during his career. The authentication code triggered memories of procedures so classified that they were mentioned only in passing during command briefings. "Stand down all weapon systems," Blake ordered, his voice tight with growing dread. "Immediately." "But, sir, we don't understand who." "That's a direct order, Lieutenant Commander," Blake interrupted sharply. "Stand down all weapons and prepare to receive incoming transmission on emergency command channels." Price hesitated, clearly wanting to challenge the order, but the authority in Blake's voice left no room for argument. He relayed the commands to the weapon stations while the tension on the bridge continued to escalate with each passing moment. "Sir," the communications officer called again, "we're receiving a secure video transmission. It's coming through on channels I didn't know existed on our systems." "Put it on the main screen," Blake ordered, dreading what he was about to see. Admiral Helen Crawford appeared on the screen, her silver hair pulled back in a severe arrangement. That emphasized the hard lines of her face. Her uniform displayed rows of decorations accumulated over decades of service, and behind her, several figures remained deliberately positioned outside the camera's view. The partially visible individuals appeared to represent both military and civilian agencies, their faces kept hidden for reasons that would soon become clear. "Commander Blake," Crawford said, her voice carrying barely controlled fury, "do you have any comprehension of what you've just done?" Blake stood at attention, though his stomach was churning with dread. "Admiral, we engaged an unresponsive civilian vessel approaching restricted waters, following standard maritime security protocols. The warning shot inadvertently struck the vessel's hull." "That's not some weekend sailor you fired on," Crawford cut him off with obvious anger. "That's Rachel Winters." Price stepped forward, unable to contain his confusion. "With respect, Admiral, who exactly is Rachel Winters? The name doesn't appear in any of our intelligence briefings." The Admiral's expression hardened further. "Someone you're not cleared to know about, Lieutenant Commander. And someone whose compromise triggers automatic reviews of this entire command structure." Multiple satellite feeds suddenly appeared on the bridge screens, showing footage that left the crew speechless. The images showed the same woman they had just encountered, but in context that redefined everything they thought they understood about their situation. The first video revealed her coordinating the extraction of American hostages from a compound that intelligence agencies had considered impossible to breach. Another showed her single-handedly preventing a bioterror attack that would have killed thousands of civilians. A third displayed her receiving classified recognition from government officials in ceremonies that officially never happened. "Winters isn't just an operative," Admiral Crawford explained as the crew absorbed the shocking footage. 20 years ago, she designed the intelligence architecture that protects our most sensitive operations. The security protocols your own systems run on were created by her. When she transitioned to independent operations, multiple agencies signed agreements guaranteeing her complete operational autonomy. Blake felt the full weight of the disaster settling on him. "Admiral, we received no notification of any sanctioned operation in this region. Our daily intelligence briefings contained no mention of authorized activities in these waters, because there wasn't supposed to be any notification." Crawford responded with growing anger. "The vessel you fired on was gathering intelligence on unauthorized Chinese military incursions that official Navy ships can't approach without creating international incidents. Her work provides us with strategic intelligence that we couldn't obtain through conventional channels." Meanwhile, on a secondary screen, they could observe Rachel still aboard her vessel. The hull damage appeared manageable. She had already deployed some kind of advanced repair system that was sealing the breach with materials that seemed far beyond standard maritime equipment. She remained on her satellite phone, her expression unchanged as she continued her conversation with parties unknown. "Who was she speaking with?" Price asked, though he was beginning to suspect he didn't want to know the answer. Crawford's expression darkened even further. "The Secretary of Defense, who has already contacted the President. This incident has triggered an automatic audit of the entire Pacific Fleet command structure. 3 people in your direct chain of command should have implemented protocols to prevent this encounter." Blake felt his career collapsing around him. "Admiral, I accept full responsibility for this incident. My crew was following my direct orders based on standard territorial enforcement procedures. This goes far beyond individual responsibility. Commander, the system failed at multiple levels before you ever made contact with her vessel. However, failure still has consequences, especially when those failures compromise operations that protect American lives." A commotion near the bridge entrance drew everyone's attention as a junior officer rushed in with obvious urgency. "Sir, an unidentified helicopter is approaching our position. It's not responding to standard identification requests." Crawford nodded curtly from the screen. That's Director Nathan Cross from Naval Intelligence. Allow the aircraft to land immediately. Nathan Cross was nearly a legendary figure within intelligence circles, the head of Naval Intelligence, whose face rarely appeared in any official capacity. His personal arrival at the scene signaled the extraordinary severity of what had just occurred. "Admiral," Blake asked, his voice barely steady, "what happens to my command now?" "Effective immediately, this patrol unit is suspended. Pending investigation. Lieutenant Commander Price will be reassigned to desk duties. 2 admirals in the Pacific Command have already submitted resignations for failures in protocol implementation." Price stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and disbelief. "Admiral, this seems completely disproportionate to what happened. We followed standard procedures for territorial enforcement." "The procedures you followed were correct," Crawford acknowledged. "But your response after identifying yourselves to the vessel showed poor judgment. You escalated when you should have exercised caution. Your service record shows a pattern of aggressive interpretation of engagement rules that finally intersected with a situation you were completely unprepared to handle properly." The helicopter approached the Hampton with military precision, and from it emerged a tall, lean man whose bearing conveyed authority without any need for display. Director Cross wore no uniform, only a tailored civilian suit that somehow projected more power than any military decoration could have achieved. Cross walked directly to the edge of the deck facing Rachel's vessel, stood at perfect attention, and rendered a formal salute that he held for an uncomfortably long time. Through binoculars, the bridge crew watched as Rachel finally acknowledged the gesture with a slight nod in exchange that felt ceremonial and ancient, like recognition between sovereigns. "What just happened?" Price whispered, the full reality of their situation finally beginning to penetrate his understanding. "Recognition," Blake responded quietly, watching as Cross turned and approached the bridge. "When a sovereign asset has been compromised by friendly forces, protocols require formal acknowledgement of the error." Before Price could ask what a sovereign asset was, Director Cross appeared on the bridge. His presence seemed to fill the entire space as his sharp, evaluating eyes examined each officer before settling on Blake. "Commander," Cross said, his voice surprisingly soft for someone with such obvious authority, "we need to discuss what happens next." The Hamptons conference room had never felt smaller than it did with Director Cross positioned at the head of the table. Blake and his senior officers sat in rigid silence, the weight of their situation pressing down on them like a physical force. Price's jaw worked silently as he struggled to contain objections that he knew would only make things worse. "Gentlemen," Cross began, his voice carrying quiet authority that demanded attention, "what occurred today represents a catastrophic failure of intelligence protocols, not tactical judgment. Your actions followed standard procedures, but those procedures should never have been applied to this situation." He activated a secure device, and a 3-dimensional holographic display materialized above the conference table. The projection showed classified files, security clearances, and operational parameters that were clearly far beyond anything Blake had ever been authorized to access. Rachel Winters operates as one of 17 Phantom-class assets working globally. These individuals function independently of standard command structures, but with full authorization from the highest levels of government. Commander Blake received briefings about their existence when he assumed command briefings, intentionally designed to be forgettable unless activated by specific circumstances. Blake felt a chill of recognition as fragments of that long ago briefing surfaced in his memory. It had seemed like routine paperwork at the time, obscure protocols covering scenarios he had assumed would never occur during his service. "Sir," Price interrupted, unable to contain himself any longer, with respect. "How are we supposed to avoid situations like this if we aren't properly informed about these operations?" This seems like an institutional failure rather than our unit's. Responsibility. Cross regarded Price with a measuring look that seemed to weigh everything about him in an instant. That's precisely correct, Lieutenant Commander. This is an institutional failure. 3 flag officers in your direct chain of command received regular updates about phantom operations in their areas of responsibility. All 3 failed to implement proper notification protocols. He manipulated the holographic display, revealing new information that painted a picture of systematic communication breakdowns. However, your personal response to the situation shows concerning patterns. Your service record indicates consistent aggressive interpretation of engagement rules. Today, those tendencies intersected with circumstances you weren't equipped to evaluate correctly. Price stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger. Sir, this is completely unjust. We followed standard procedures for unresponsive vessels in territorial waters. The warning shot was intended to be non-threatening. A warning shot that struck the target vessel. Cross counted calmly. But that's not why you're being reassigned. Your file shows repeated instances of pushing for escalation rather than de-escalation. Today's incident simply provided the final evidence needed for administrative action. Blake cleared his throat, accepting the inevitable. Sir, what exactly? Does Rachel Winters do that makes her so valuable? Why wasn't there any mention of her activities in our operational briefings? Cross considered the question carefully before responding. Winters specializes in operations that cannot exist officially. When government agencies need complete deniability combined with absolute effectiveness, they utilize assets like her. The intelligence gathering you interrupted today involves Chinese military developments that our official vessels cannot monitor without risking international incidents. The full scope of what they had stumbled into was beginning to register with the assembled officers. They had fired on someone whose work was apparently critical to national security, someone operating under protections they had never known existed. Sir, Blake asked after a moment's consideration, request permission to personally apologize to Miss Winters. The request clearly surprised Cross, who studied Blake with renewed interest. Why do you feel that's necessary, Commander? Because someone should acknowledge the error directly, sir. If I'm the commanding officer responsible for this incident, the apology should come from me personally. Cross nodded slowly. Permission granted. She's still conducting repairs on her vessel. I'll arrange transportation. As the other officers began filing out, Cross gestured for Blake to remain behind. Once they were alone, the intelligence director's demeanor shifted subtly, becoming less formally intimidating and more like a weary veteran sharing hard-earned wisdom. Blake, there's something you should understand about what happened today. Winters isn't angry about this incident. It served a purpose she had been hoping to achieve. Blake processed this unexpected information. Sir, you're saying she deliberately placed herself in our path? Assets like Winters' test systems by finding their breaking points, Cross explained. Today, she discovered a critical gap in our security protocols. The fact that you encountered her at all means someone in your chain of command failed to implement crucial procedures. That failure needed to be exposed before someone with hostile intentions could exploit the same vulnerability. The implications were staggering. So this was all planned? She wanted us to find her? She wanted to test whether the system would work correctly when confronted with a Phantom-class asset. Today, the system failed that test. Now we can address the failures before they compromise operations that actually matter. Blake felt a strange mixture of relief and deeper concern. Then why the suspensions and resignations? Why the career? Consequences? Because failure still has real-world consequences, Cross replied. Lives depend on these systems working correctly. When they don't work, people need to be held accountable so that others understand the importance of following protocols precisely. Cross stood and moved toward the door. Your transportation will be ready in 20 minutes. I suggest you prepare your remarks carefully." Winters agreed to this meeting, which is unusual for someone in her position. 20 minutes later, Blake found himself in a small watercraft approaching the meridian. From this distance, he could see the hull damage more clearly, a relatively small breach that Rachel had already repaired with some kind of advanced polymer system. The material had bonded seamlessly with the original hull, creating a repair that looked stronger than the surrounding structure. As his boat drew alongside, he noticed details that had been invisible from the Hamptons Bridge. What appeared to be decorative elements were actually reinforced sections. Standard marine equipment had been subtly modified for purposes he could only guess at. Sensor arrays were camouflaged within seemingly ordinary fixtures, and the glass appeared to be significantly thicker than civilian vessels would typically require. Rachel stood on deck, watching his approach with calm attention. Up close, she looked remarkably ordinary weathered clothing, practical gear, and an unremarkable appearance that was clearly calculated to avoid drawing attention or being memorable in any crowd. "Permission to come aboard," Blake called formally. She nodded once, stepping aside to allow him space to climb onto her deck without ceremony. Blake stood awkwardly as Rachel continued working on final repairs to the hull breach, her movements precise and efficient. The damage had been minor, but her methodical approach suggested someone who had dealt with far more serious emergencies under much worse conditions. "Miss Winters," Blake began formally, "I want to apologize personally for the actions taken by my vessel and crew. The warning shot was never intended to strike your boat, and I take full responsibility for the failure in judgment that led to this incident." "Commander," she interrupted without looking up from her work, "I placed myself in your path deliberately. This was a scheduled test of response protocols. Your tactical assessment was completely correct. Your intelligence briefing was inadequate." Her voice carried no trace of accusation or anger, just matter-of-fact assessment delivered with the curiosity, confidence of someone who understood exactly what had happened and why. Blake found himself struck by how different she seemed up close. Her eyes reflected a depth of experience that made his own years of service feel like elementary training. "They're dismantling our entire unit because of this," Blake said, unable to keep frustration from creeping into his voice. Rachel finally looked up, her sharp gaze evaluating him with the same precision she had applied to her repairs. "No, Commander. They're restructuring because 3 people in your chain of command knew about Phantom protocols and failed to implement them properly. The system failed today, not you personally." She reached into a waterproof container and extracted a small device no larger than a standard memory drive. "When you receive your new assignment next month, and you will be reassigned, not discharged, connect this to any secure terminal. It will provide access to the briefing materials you should have received before today's encounter." Blake took the device cautiously, turning it over in his hands. "How do you know I'll be reassigned? How do you know what my future orders will be?" For the first time, Rachel offered a slight smile, an expression that transformed her entire appearance. "Because I helped design the career pathway protocols that determine officer assignments after incidents like today. Your response to this situation has demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment that certain specialized units value highly." The implications of what she was telling him were almost too large to comprehend. "You're saying my career isn't over?" "Your old career is finished," she acknowledged. "But careers end and begin all the time in military service. What matters is whether you learn from experiences like today and apply that knowledge to future challenges." Blake pocketed the device carefully. "Miss Winters, may I ask you something off the record?" "You can ask. I might choose not to answer." "How many people like you are there? Assets operating independently like this?" Rachel considered the question while securing her repair tools with practiced efficiency. Fewer than there were during the height of the war on terror. The program became too large, too unwieldy. Too many agencies were creating independent assets without proper coordination. Some went rogue, others burned out completely. Now we were more selective about recruitment and more careful about operational parameters. She checked readings on instrument panels that were far more sophisticated than anything typically found on civilian vessels. The division you'll likely be assigned to supports assets like me without attempting to control us. It maintains necessary boundaries between official and unofficial operations. Blake absorbed this information while watching her complete her post-repair checklist. In today's incident, will it appear in any official reports? The intelligence your encounter provided will be sanitized and introduced through conventional channels. Chinese naval activities in this region will be addressed through appropriate diplomatic and military responses. The Myanmar government will receive reports about cyber attacks of unknown origin. International maritime organizations will continue their work, unaware they provided cover for intelligence operations. Her tone made it clear that these arrangements were not open for discussion or debate. Sometimes the most successful operations are the ones that never officially happened. As she prepared to engage her vessel's propulsion systems, Blake realized this might be his only opportunity to ask the question that had been troubling him most. The call sign I heard on our communications system earlier, Nightingale. Is that what they call you? Rachel paused in her preparations, studying him with renewed interest. That's one of several identifiers used in different operational contexts. Names have power, Commander. The wrong people knowing the right names can compromise years of work. She moved to her control station and began activating systems that transformed the vessel's appearance entirely. Panels shifted, concealed equipment became visible, and the entire boat took on a configuration that bore little resemblance to the civilian craft he had first observed. "Thank you for your time, Miss Winters," Blake said formally, preparing to return to his transport. "Commander," she called as he reached the edge of her deck. "That device I gave you contains more than just briefing materials. When you're ready to understand what that means, you'll know how to use it." As Blake's transport carried him back toward the Hampton, he looked over his shoulder in time to witness something extraordinary. The Meridian-activated propulsion systems that had been completely hidden during their encounter, accelerating smoothly beneath the surface until it disappeared entirely from view. By the time his boat reached the Hampton, the sea showed no trace that Rachel Winters had ever been there. Back aboard his ship, Blake found Director Cross waiting on the bridge. The other officers maintained respectful distance, leaving the two men in relative privacy for their final conversation. "She gave you something," Cross observed. It wasn't a question. Blake nodded, patting his pocket where the device rested securely. "She said I would understand when to use it." "And you will," Cross agreed, looking out at the empty ocean where Rachel's vessel had vanished. "Commander, your next assignment was going to be administrative work at Pacific Command Headquarters. Policy coordination and paperwork processing." Blake waited, sensing there was more to come. Naval Intelligence has a specialized unit that focuses on unconventional threats and irregular operations. Officers with your particular combination of field experience and adaptive thinking are rare commodities in that environment. Cross handed him a sealed envelope. "Your alternative orders, should you choose to accept them. You have 72 hours to decide." As Cross departed for his helicopter, Blake opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet containing coordinates, a date 2 weeks in the future, and a simple message. The Phantom Division welcomes qualified candidates. Briefing materials will be provided upon arrival. That evening, Blake stood alone on the Hampton's deck, watching the sun set over the South China Sea. The ship would remain on station for another day before returning to port. where most of the crew would receive new assignments scattered across the Pacific Fleet. His thoughts returned to Rachel Winters, to Nightingale, and the glimpse he had gotten of operations that existed in the shadows between official channels. A world of independent assets and classified protocols, of missions that succeeded by never officially existing. He removed the device from his pocket, studying its unmarked surface in the fading light. Not yet, he decided. Not until he understood more about what he was being offered and what accepting would mean for his future. But as he looked out at the horizon, Blake found himself wondering if somewhere beneath those waves, Nightingale was continuing her work, gathering intelligence that would protect lives he would never know about. And for the first time since the incident began, he found himself looking forward to discovering what came next. 3 months later, Commander Marcus Blake sat in an office that officially didn't exist, reviewing files that would have been impossible for him to access in his previous position. The transition from ship command to intelligence work had been more challenging than he had anticipated, but Blake had adapted with surprising speed to the world of shadows and classified operations. His new workspace was located in a building that appeared on no standard military maps, equipped with security systems that required biometric authentication at multiple levels. The walls were soundproofed, the windows were reinforced against both surveillance and attack, and the entire facility was swept for electronic monitoring devices multiple times daily. The classified file open on his secure terminal detailed Rachel Winters' ongoing operations across the globe, missions she had completed without recognition, lives she had saved without acknowledgement, and intelligence she had gathered from places where official American assets couldn't operate without diplomatic consequences. Blake scrolled through reports of terrorist plots disrupted before they could develop, technological innovations field-tested years before they would reach standard military units, and diplomatic crises quietly resolved through means that left no official fingerprints. Each operation had been planned and executed with precision that made conventional military actions look crude by comparison. At the bottom of the current file was a personal note that had become familiar over the past weeks. Some serve in the light, others serve in shadow. Both are necessary for the system to function effectively. Blake closed the file and inserted the device Rachel had given him into his secure terminal. As she had promised, it unlocked access to briefing materials he should have received before their encounter in the South China Sea. Information about maritime zones where independent assets might operate, recognition protocols for various types of encounters, and proper response procedures that would have prevented the entire incident. The intelligence would have been invaluable 3 months ago. Now it served as a reminder of how much he still didn't understand about the world he had entered. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Director Cross entered without waiting for a response, carrying himself with the same quiet authority that had impressed Blake during their first meeting. "Commander, we have a developing situation that requires immediate attention. Conference room in 5 minutes." Blake followed Cross down a corridor that required multiple security clearances to access. They entered a room where several intelligence officials were already gathered around a table displaying holographic maps and real-time data streams. Blake recognized some faces from his briefings over the past months, but others remained strangers whose roles in the organization were deliberately obscured. 18 hours ago, Cross began without preamble. "We lost contact with one of our independent assets operating in the Andaman Sea. Asset designation: Phoenix was tracking a cargo vessel suspected of transporting advanced weapon systems to insurgent forces in Myanmar." Blake studied the tactical display showing Phoenix's last known position. Equipment failure or hostile interference? Unknown at this time. Her emergency beacon activated briefly before going completely dark. Search and rescue operations are complicated, by the fact that we have no official military presence in those waters without creating significant diplomatic complications. An intelligence analyst stepped forward with additional information. Latest satellite imagery shows increased patrol activity from Myanmar's naval forces in the region where we lost contact. They may have intercepted our asset before she could complete her intelligence-gathering mission. Cross's expression darkened as he absorbed this information. If they've captured an independent asset, protocols require immediate extraction before they understand what they have in custody. Blake ventured a question that seemed obvious but needed to be asked. Sir, have we considered requesting assistance from Nightingale? Her operational area covers that region, and she has resources we don't typically have access to. The room fell silent as the other officials exchanged meaningful glances. Cross studied Blake with renewed attention. That's exactly why you're here, Commander. Nightingale has already made contact through secure channels. She's requesting you specifically for a joint extraction operation. Blake felt surprise register on his face. Me? Why would she want someone with my limited experience in this type of operation? She believes your direct experience with her operational methods gives you advantages that most intelligence officers lack. You've seen her work under pressure and understand how she adapts to unexpected situations. Cross slid a tablet across the table containing mission parameters that were deliberately vague. Your orders are unusually open-ended for this type of operation. Assist Nightingale in extracting the compromised asset and any associated intelligence materials. Use of force is authorized as necessary, but with no official acknowledgement of American involvement if the operation is compromised. Blake reviewed the mission details, noting how much was left to operational discretion. Sir, what's my cover story if things go wrong during the extraction? You're on personal leave, taking a private sailing vacation in international waters. If captured, you're a civilian contractor who made extremely poor decisions about where to conduct recreational activities. Cross's expression made it clear this wasn't entirely a joke. Extraction support will be available, but they won't enter territorial waters unless the situation becomes absolutely critical to American interests. 6 hours later, Blake found himself aboard a high-speed transport heading across the Andaman Sea under cover of darkness. The night was moonless perfect. Conditions for covert operations that needed to avoid satellite surveillance and patrol vessel detection. As they approached the rendezvous coordinates, the pilot reduced speed and began scanning for their contact vessel. Commander, we're 5 minutes from the designated coordinates. No visual contact with target vessel yet. Blake wasn't surprised by the lack of immediate visual confirmation. She'll find us when she's ready. Maintain position and wait for contact. Right on schedule, navigation lights appeared off their port side, emerging from what had seemed like empty ocean. The Meridian looked different from their previous encounter, its hull now matte black that absorbed light rather than reflecting. Its profile somehow lower and more predatory than the civilian vessel he remembered. As they drew alongside Rachel's boat, Blake could see her waiting on deck. She wore tactical gear, now instead of civilian sailing clothes, functional equipment darkened to avoid reflection, with specialized tools that spoke to the serious nature of their mission. Permission to come aboard, Blake called softly across the water. Granted, Rachel responded, her voice carrying clearly despite its low volume. Once aboard, Blake dismissed his transport with a predetermined signal. The craft disappeared back toward international waters, leaving him alone with Nightingale in hostile territory. Commander, she greeted him formally. Welcome to the Meridian. I trust your transition to intelligence work has been educational. Very much so, Blake replied. I understand we have an extraction to perform. She led him below deck where the civilian appearance of her vessel gave way to technology that would have impressed the most sophisticated military units. Screens displayed satellite imagery, thermal surveillance data, and communications intercepts that painted a detailed picture of their operational environment. Phoenix was compromised while tracking a weapons shipment, Rachel explained, bringing up tactical displays that showed the target area. The last transmission confirmed intelligence about next-generation anti-ship missiles being delivered to insurgent forces. Myanmar's Navy intercepted her before she could transmit the complete intelligence package. Blake studied the information carefully. Do they understand what they have? Not yet. Her cover identity as an environmental researcher studying coral reef degradation is solid. But that protection won't last if certain international actors become involved in her interrogation. Blake understood the implication immediately. Chinese intelligence advisors. Rachel's expression confirmed his assessment. Beijing has military advisory personnel stationed with Myanmar's naval forces. If they participate in questioning Phoenix, her cover will be compromised within hours. She pulled up detailed schematics of a coastal detention facility. She's being held here, approximately 10 kilometers inland from the main naval base. Security is minimal because they're treating her as a routine territorial violator rather than a potential intelligence asset. Blake examined the approach vectors and security patterns displayed on her screens. Direct insertion by sea would be possible, but extraction could become complicated if we're carrying an injured or unconscious asset. Exactly my assessment, Rachel agreed. Which is why we're not using the conventional approach. The plan she outlined was audacious to the point of seeming reckless. At least it would have seemed that way to conventional military planners. They would pose as international environmental inspectors from a recognized conservation organization, using credentials that Rachel had already prepared through channels Blake didn't want to know about. The Myanmar government has been allowing these inspections as goodwill gestures to improve their international standing, Rachel explained. These credentials will get us through the primary checkpoints without raising suspicions. She handed him a complete set of documentation and appropriate clothing for his cover identity. Once inside the facility, we locate Phoenix, create a controlled distraction to mask our extraction, and leave through the service road here, she indicated. A secondary exit route on the facility map. Blake studied the plan, impressed despite himself by its simplicity. And if something goes wrong? Then we adapt and improvise, Rachel responded matter-of-factly. I have a local contact positioned with transportation for rapid departure if our primary exit route becomes compromised. The infiltration proceeded with surprising smoothness. Their credentials passed inspection at 2 separate checkpoints, with Rachel handling all interactions in fluent Burmese, while Blake maintained his cover as her American colleague conducting environmental assessments. The detention facility was basic but well organized. They were escorted through administrative areas by a junior officer eager to demonstrate his unit's compliance with international protocols. When they requested to interview the environmental researcher detained 2 days earlier, there was only minimal bureaucratic resistance. Wait here, their escort instructed, leaving them in an office while he consulted with his superiors about their request. The moment they were alone, Rachel moved to the facility's computer terminal and inserted a device similar to the one she had given Blake months earlier, creating our extraction cover and erasing security logs simultaneously, she explained, her fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. We have approximately 7 minutes before system administrators notice the intrusion. When their escort returned with authorization to interview the prisoner, they were led to a detention block, separated from the main administrative building. The cells were simple, but not inhumane, further evidence that the Myanmar authorities hadn't yet recognized the true value of what they had captured. Phoenix turned out to be a compact, athletic woman with closely cropped hair and the cautious eyes of someone accustomed to operating alone in dangerous environments. She showed no recognition when they entered her cell, maintaining her environmental researcher cover even under these circumstances. "Miss Davis," Rachel addressed her formally, using her cover identity. "We're here from the International Marine Conservation Alliance to discuss your research activities in protected waters." Phoenix played her role perfectly, launching into a detailed explanation of coral reef monitoring protocols that would have convinced any casual observer. But when the guards stepped outside to give them privacy for their interview, her demeanor changed instantly. "Extraction in progress?" she asked quietly. "Confirmed," Rachel responded. "Intelligence package status?" "Compromised during capture. Had to destroy the physical evidence, but I memorized the critical data. Shipping manifests, weapon specifications, delivery protocols. Chinese military involvement confirmed at multiple levels." Rachel nodded with satisfaction. "Blake, prepare for immediate departure. 3 minutes." Right on schedule, alarms began blaring throughout the compound. Emergency lights flashed as a computerized voice announced security protocols in Chinese. Rather than Burmese, Rachel's diversion forcing the facility to respond to what appeared to be a foreign military system override. In the confusion that followed, they escorted Phoenix through service corridors that Rachel seemed to know perfectly. Guards rushed past them toward the administrative buildings, paying no attention to 3 people walking purposefully in the opposite direction. At the service entrance, an unmarked truck waited with a local driver who acknowledged Rachel with nothing more than a brief nod. They climbed into the cargo area, concealed by tarps and equipment, and began their journey back toward the coast. "Very smooth extraction," Blake commented once they were safely underway. "Almost too smooth," Rachel agreed, giving him an appraising look. "You noticed the coordinated timing, the convenient absence of senior security personnel, the perfectly positioned transportation." Blake had indeed noticed those details. This level of coordination suggests assets inside their organization. "Excellent observation, Commander. We maintain contacts in many places. Some individuals know they're providing assistance. Others simply receive unexpected career opportunities when they make decisions that benefit our operations." Phoenix spoke up from beneath her concealment. "The intelligence package is solid. Chinese next-generation anti-ship missiles with modified targeting systems specifically designed to defeat American carrier group defenses. They're using Myanmar insurgent groups as cover for field testing." Blake absorbed this information. "That intelligence justifies the extraction risk. But how did you allow yourself to be captured?" "I didn't allow anything," Phoenix responded, with a slight smile. "My capture was deliberately orchestrated. We needed to confirm which Chinese military officers were embedded with Myanmar's naval forces. Now we have names, faces, and operational patterns." Blake stared at her, then at Rachel. "This entire operation was designed to gather intelligence about their intelligence operations." "Partially correct," Rachel clarified. "We needed specific information that couldn't be obtained through remote surveillance. Phoenix's temporary detention created opportunities to map their response protocols and identify key personnel. Our extraction by us forces them to reveal additional security measures." Blake was beginning to understand the layers of complexity involved in these operations. "And my participation serves what purpose in this larger scheme?" "Multiple purposes," Rachel acknowledged. "It demonstrates to Direct Across that you can operate effectively in sovereign asset scenarios. It provides you with practical experience in extraction operations. And it allows me to evaluate your potential for future collaborative missions." They reached the coastline shortly before dawn, transferring to a fishing vessel that carried them beyond territorial waters. By mid-morning, they had rendezvoused with the Meridian, which had been operating under remote control during their inland mission. Once safely aboard and heading for international waters, Phoenix transferred her memorized intelligence to Rachel's secure systems before retiring to rest. Blake found himself alone with Rachel on the bridge as she set course away from Myanmar's territorial boundaries. "Commander," she said after a period of comfortable silence, "your performance exceeded my expectations for someone with limited experience in this type of operation." "Thank you," Blake replied, though he sensed there was more to come. He watched her hands move confidently across the vessel's controls, noting how the advanced systems responded to her commands with precision that spoke to years of experience. "May I ask you something off the record?" "You can ask." "I might choose not to answer. How many independent assets are currently operating at your level? People with the autonomy and resources you have access to?" Rachel considered the question while making minor course adjustments. Fewer than during the peak years of the War on Terror. The program expanded too rapidly during that period, with too many agencies creating independent assets without proper coordination. Some assets went completely rogue, others burned out under the pressure. Now we're more selective about recruitment and more careful about operational oversight. She glanced at him with obvious assessment. "The Phantom Division you've been assigned to supports assets like us without attempting to control us. It maintains necessary boundaries between official operations and work that needs to exist outside normal channels." Blake absorbed this explanation while watching the horizon for potential threats. "And today's mission, will it appear in any official reports or briefings?" Phoenix's intelligence will be processed and introduced through conventional channels, without reference to how it was obtained. The Myanmar government will investigate what they'll believe was a sophisticated cyber attack of unknown origin. International conservation organizations will continue their legitimate work, unaware they provided cover for our operation. Her tone made it clear these arrangements were not subject to discussion or modification. The most successful operations are often the ones that leave no trace of having occurred. As they reached truly international waters, Rachel engaged her vessel's advanced propulsion systems. The Meridian accelerated smoothly, leaving minimal wake despite its impressive speed. "We'll reach your extraction point in 4 hours," she informed him. "Until then, I suggest you use the time to rest and process what you've experienced." Blake studied her profile as she focused on navigation. "After this, do we simply return to our separate operational worlds until the next crisis? Requires collaboration?" Rachel was quiet for a moment, seeming to weigh her response carefully. "The device I gave you months ago, have you explored its full capabilities beyond accessing the briefing materials?" "No, I've only used it for the intelligence protocols you mentioned. When you're ready for the next phase, it contains additional access systems. Secure communication channels that bypass official networks entirely. There may be situations where your position within the formal structure and my position outside it create useful operational synergies." Blake nodded slowly, understanding the offer being extended. "I'll remember that, Nightingale." For the first time during their mission, she smiled a genuine expression that transformed her entire appearance. "I believe you will, Commander." 4 hours later, as his extraction transport arrived to return him to official duties, Blake watched the Meridian disappear beyond the horizon. He knew better than to look for it on tracking systems or satellite surveillance. Rachel Winters would vanish as completely as she had appeared, continuing her work in the spaces between official operations. But the device in his pocket represented more than just emergency communication protocols. It was a bridge between the world of formal military structure and the shadow realm where people like Nightingale served without recognition or acknowledgement. As his transport headed toward familiar waters and official debriefings, Blake found himself looking forward to whatever challenges would eventually activate those secure communication channels. He was beginning to understand that some of the Most important work happened in the spaces between official operations. Work that required people who could navigate both worlds without being fully contained by either. 6 months after the Myanmar extraction, Blake had settled into his new role within the Phantom Division with a competence that surprised even his superiors. His office in the intelligence complex had become a nerve center for coordinating between official operations and the shadow world of independent assets. The walls were covered with monitoring screens displaying global intelligence feeds, secure communication systems, and analysis tools that allowed him to track dozens of operations simultaneously. The transition from commanding a single naval vessel to overseeing multiple classified operations across different theaters had challenged every assumption Blake held about military service. In his previous role, success was measured by clear metric: ships maintained, missions completed, personnel managed effectively. In the intelligence world, success was often measured by disasters that never occurred, threats that were neutralized before they fully developed, and crises that were resolved so quietly that they never appeared in any official reports. Blake's secure terminal chimed with an incoming priority message. The sender identification showed only Rachel's designated code for communications that required immediate attention. He activated the message using the enhanced protocols from the device she had given him months earlier. "Commander, we have a developing situation that requires your expertise. Asset Phoenix has gone dark during a surveillance operation in the Persian Gulf. Last communication indicated she had identified a weapons trafficking network with connections to multiple hostile actors. Request immediate consultation on extraction protocols." Blake studied the message, noting the formal tone that indicated serious operational concerns. Phoenix was the same asset they had extracted from Myanmar. Her capture now would compromise not only her current mission, but potentially expose the entire network of operations they had conducted in Southeast Asia. He activated his secure communication system and sent a response. "Nightingale, understood. Available for immediate coordination. What assets do you need from official channels?" The response came within minutes. "Meet me at coordinates. I'm transmitting separately. Come prepared for extended maritime operations." This situation is more complex than a simple extraction. Blake gathered his operational gear and reviewed Phoenix's personnel file while preparing for departure. Her real name was Jennifer Walsh, a former Navy intelligence specialist who had transitioned to independent operations after distinguishing herself during classified missions in North Africa. Her psychological profile indicated exceptional performance under pressure, but also a tendency toward taking calculated risks that sometimes pushed operational boundaries. The coordinates Rachel had transmitted led to international waters, approximately 200 nautical miles from the Strait of Hormuz, a location that would allow them to plan operations near one of the world's most politically sensitive maritime regions without triggering automatic surveillance from multiple nations. Blake's transport reached the rendezvous point just after sunset, finding the Meridian waiting in the gathering darkness. The vessel's appearance had been modified again, this time configured for extended operations in hostile waters. Additional antenna arrays were visible, along with equipment that suggested capability for electronic warfare and advanced surveillance. "Permission to come aboard," Blake called as his transport drew alongside. "Granted, Commander. We have significant developments to discuss." Once aboard, Rachel led him to her command center, where multiple screens displayed intelligence data that painted a disturbing picture. Satellite imagery showed increased naval activity throughout the Persian Gulf, with several nations positioning assets in response to what appeared to be escalating tensions. Phoenix was tracking a weapons trafficking operation that we initially believed involved only regional actors. Rachel began pulling up shipping manifests and financial records. Her latest intelligence indicates this network has connections to state-sponsored terrorism, Operations targeting American interests. Blake studied the data, noting the sophistication of the financial arrangements and the geographic scope of the operations. This is significantly larger than typical arms trafficking. These funding sources suggest government backing. Exactly. Phoenix identified a cargo vessel carrying advanced weaponry that's scheduled to rendezvous with contacts in 3 different countries. The weapons include anti-aircraft systems that could be used against civilian aviation, explosive devices suitable for urban terrorism, and communication equipment that would allow terrorist cells to coordinate attacks across multiple continents. Rachel manipulated the displays to show Phoenix's last known position. She was maintaining surveillance on the cargo vessel when her communications went dark. Satellite imagery shows her boat was intercepted by what appears to be a private security vessel operating in international waters. Blake examined the tactical situation. Private security suggests the trafficking network has resources beyond typical criminal organizations. They're operating with near military capability, which is why this extraction requires coordination with official assets, Rachel acknowledged. I need access to Navy surveillance systems that can track the cargo vessel while we focus on recovering. Phoenix. Blake considered the request, weighing operational security against the need for resources. I can provide satellite intelligence and communication support without revealing the nature of our operation. But any direct military intervention would require official authorization that we can't obtain without compromising the entire mission. Understood. I'm not requesting direct intervention, just intelligence support that allows us to plan an effective extraction. Rachel activated additional screens, showing real-time intelligence feeds from multiple sources. Phoenix's capture wasn't accidental. Someone within the trafficking network identified her as more than a routine maritime observer. That suggests either superior surveillance capabilities or information from sources we haven't identified. The implications were troubling. You're suggesting there might be a security breach in our operations. I'm suggesting we proceed with the assumption that hostile actors have better intelligence about our activities than we prefer. Phoenix's safety depends on extracting her before they understand exactly what they've captured. Blake studied the operational parameters displayed on Rachel's screens. What's your proposed approach? We create a distraction that forces them to divide their attention while we extract Phoenix from their primary vessel. The cargo ship continues toward its destination while we intercept communications that will allow us to disrupt their delivery. Schedule. She pulled up detailed schematics of the vessel holding Phoenix. It's a converted cargo ship with enhanced security capabilities. Approximately 30 personnel, including what appears to be professional military contractors. They're treating Phoenix as a valuable prisoner rather than a routine hostage. Blake absorbed the tactical information while considering resource requirements. How do you propose to create sufficient distraction to cover an extraction from a heavily defended vessel? Rachel's expression suggested she had been hoping he would ask that question. By convincing multiple naval forces in the area that the cargo vessel represents a threat to their national interests. International waters become very complicated when several nations believe their security is being threatened. The plan she outlined was sophisticated enough to impress conventional military strategists. Using intelligence about the weapons trafficking network, they would provide selective information to naval forces from different countries, each receiving just enough data to justify increased surveillance of the cargo vessel. The Iranian Navy will receive intelligence suggesting the weapons are destined for groups hostile to their interests. The Saudi Navy will learn about potential threats to their maritime security. The American Fifth Fleet will be informed about anti-aircraft weapons that could threaten civilian aviation. Blake began to understand the elegance of her approach. Each navy will increase their surveillance and interdiction activities, creating multiple pressure points that force the trafficking network to focus on protecting their primary cargo rather than maintaining security around Phoenix. Exactly. While they're managing multiple naval forces showing interest in their operation, we extract Phoenix and gather intelligence about their broader network. Blake considered the risks and benefits of the proposed operation. This approach requires precise timing and coordination. If any of the naval forces become aware of our involvement, it could compromise both official and unofficial operations in the region. Which is why I need someone with your experience coordinating between official and unofficial channels, Rachel acknowledged. Your position within the Phantom Division gives you access to intelligence systems and communication protocols that I can't reach directly. Blake nodded slowly, accepting the necessity of the collaboration. I'll need 12 hours to arrange the intelligence sharing without revealing our operational interest. Can Phoenix's situation remain stable that long? According to our surveillance, they're transporting her toward a location where more sophisticated interrogation resources will be available. We have perhaps 18 hours before her situation becomes critical. Rachel began configuring her vessel systems for extended operations in hostile waters. Commander, there's something else you should understand about this mission. Phoenix's intelligence about the weapons trafficking network indicates connections to groups that have been targeting independent assets. Blake felt a chill of understanding. They're not just trafficking weapons. They're hunting people like you. The possibility has existed for several years, but Phoenix's intelligence provides the first concrete evidence. This extraction isn't just about recovering one asset. It's about disrupting a network that threatens the entire program. The stakes were higher than Blake had initially understood. How many other assets might be at risk? Unknown. The network appears to have sophisticated intelligence gathering capabilities and resources that suggest state sponsorship. Phoenix's capture may have been a field test of their ability to identify and neutralize independent assets. Rachel finished her system preparations and turned to face Blake directly. Commander, this operation will determine whether people like Phoenix and me can continue operating effectively, or whether we need to fundamentally change how we approach our missions. Blake understood the broader implications. If they can identify and capture independent assets systematically, the entire shadow intelligence network becomes vulnerable. Exactly. Which is why this extraction must succeed completely, not just recovering Phoenix, but gathering intelligence that allows us to disrupt their operations before they can target other assets. Blake activated his secure communication systems and began coordinating with intelligence resources that could provide the support Rachel needed. I'll have the intelligence packages ready for distribution to the relevant naval forces within 8 hours. That should give us the operational window we need. As he worked on arranging the complex intelligence operation, Blake reflected on how far his understanding had evolved since that first encounter in the South China Sea. What had seemed like a simple case of mistaken identity had led him into a world where the most important battles were fought by people whose names would never appear in history books, whose sacrifices would never be publicly acknowledged. But those sacrifices protected lives and preserved freedoms that millions of people took for granted. And Blake was beginning to understand that some forms of service were too important to require recognition. 12 hours later, Blake watched from the Meridian's command center as their carefully orchestrated plan began to unfold across the Persian Gulf. Multiple screens displayed the positions of naval vessels from 4 different nations, each responding to intelligence reports that have been crafted to appear completely unrelated, but which collectively created a complex web of surveillance around the weapons trafficking operation. Iranian patrol boats are increasing their interdiction activities along the northern shipping lanes, Blake reported, monitoring official communication channels. They've received intelligence suggesting weapon shipments destined for groups hostile to their regional interests. Rachel manipulated her displays to show the broader tactical picture. Saudi naval forces are conducting expanded searches of cargo vessels approaching their territorial waters. The American Fifth Fleet has positioned additional surveillance assets to monitor potential threats to civilian aviation. The effect was exactly what they had hoped to achieve. The cargo vessel holding Phoenix found itself under scrutiny from multiple directions, forcing the trafficking network to focus their resources on protecting their primary shipment rather than maintaining tight security around their prisoner. Phoenix's transport vessel is altering course, Blake observed, tracking the ship's movement through satellite surveillance. They're moving away from the main shipping channels, probably trying to avoid the increased naval activity, which brings them closer to our operational area, Rachel noted with satisfaction. Sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to convince your opponents to solve it for you. She activated additional surveillance systems that had been monitoring communications traffic from the trafficking network. Their operational security is breaking down under pressure. We're intercepting discussions about accelerating their delivery schedule and reducing security personnel around secondary assets. Blake studied the intercepts, noting the increasing signs of strain in their communications. They're being forced to choose between protecting their cargo and maintaining control over Phoenix. The multiple pressure points are working exactly as you predicted. Rachel began preparing her vessel for direct action. Time to execute the extraction while their attention is divided. Are your official intelligence channels prepared to support the final phase? Blake checked his secure systems, confirming that the coordinated naval activities would continue providing cover for their operation. All elements are in position. The intelligence packages will keep multiple naval forces focused on the cargo vessel for at least 6 more hours. The Meridian transformed once again as Rachel engaged systems that had remained hidden during their approach. The vessel's hull reconfigured for high-speed operations, advanced sensor arrays became active, and weapon systems that had been completely concealed emerged from hidden compartments. The extraction point is 43 minutes away at maximum speed, Rachel calculated, plotting their intercept course. Phoenix's transport is maintaining a predictable heading, probably trying to reach territorial waters where they'll have additional protection. As they closed the distance to their target, Blake found himself impressed by the level of coordination required to execute such a complex operation. Every element had to function perfectly official intelligence channels, providing cover, multiple naval forces creating distractions, and their own approach timed to exploit the resulting confusion. "Commander," Rachel said as they approached the final phase, "this extraction will likely involve direct confrontation with professional military contractors. Your experience will be valuable, but the operational parameters are significantly different from conventional naval engagements." Blake understood the warning. Rules of engagement? Minimize casualties when possible, but Phoenix's recovery is the primary objective. These people are trafficking weapons that will be used to kill civilians. They've demonstrated willingness to capture and interrogate American intelligence assets. Consider them hostile combatants operating outside any legal protection. The transport vessel came into visual range just as the sun reached its zenith, creating optimal conditions for their approach. The ship was larger than Blake had expected, a converted cargo vessel with visible modifications for security operations. Armed personnel were positioned at key points around the deck, and the ship's communications equipment suggested sophisticated coordination capabilities. 37 personnel visible on deck and superstructure, Rachel reported, studying the target through advanced optics. Phoenix is likely being held in the main cargo area or converted holding cells below deck. Blake monitored their approach while tracking the positions of other naval forces in the region. Iranian patrol boats are maintaining pressure on the main cargo vessel. Saudi forces are conducting searches of suspicious vessels in their territorial waters. American surveillance assets are providing overwatch for the entire operation. Perfect timing, Rachel acknowledged. Execute extraction in 3 minutes. The approach phase demonstrated capabilities that Blake had never seen outside of classified military operations. The Meridian became nearly invisible to conventional detection systems while maintaining perfect positioning relative to their target. Rachel's control of the vessel showed years of experience in similar operations, her movements precise and economical. Initiating electronic countermeasures, she announced, activating systems that began disrupting the target vessels. Communications and navigation equipment. Their ability to call for support or coordinate defensive responses is now compromised. Blake watched as confusion spread across the target vessel's crew. Personnel moved frantically between communication stations, trying to restore systems that had been selectively disabled. The electronic warfare capabilities Rachel's vessel possessed were clearly beyond anything typically available to civilian operations. Boarding action in 60 seconds, Rachel announced, preparing equipment that would allow them to rapidly access the target vessel. Phoenix's location has been confirmed through thermal imaging. Main cargo hold, lower level, approximately 12 meters from the primary access point. The boarding operation proceeded with military precision. Rachel's approach eliminated resistance systematically while Blake secured their escape route and monitored for approaching threats. The trafficking network's personnel were professional but unprepared for the level of capability they faced. Phoenix was found exactly where thermal imaging had indicated, restrained but uninjured in a makeshift holding cell. Her condition suggested she had been interrogated but had maintained her cover identity successfully. About time, she commented as Blake freed her from her restraints. I was beginning to wonder if anyone had noticed I was missing. Your extraction was delayed by operational complexity, Rachel replied, helping Phoenix gather intelligence materials she had managed to conceal during her capture. Did you obtain the information we needed about their network structure? Complete shipping manifests, financial records, and personnel identifications, Phoenix confirmed. This trafficking operation is much larger than we initially assessed. They have connections to state-sponsored terrorism groups in at least 6 countries. Blake secured the intelligence materials while Rachel prepared for rapid departure. How much time before they can restore communications and call for support? Approximately 15 minutes before partial restoration, 30 minutes before full capability, Rachel calculated. More than sufficient for our withdrawal. The extraction concluded as smoothly as it had begun, with the Meridian disappearing from the area before the trafficking network could organize any response. By the time their communications were restored, Blake and Rachel were beyond the range of any pursuit, heading toward international waters with Phoenix and the intelligence she had gathered. Mission accomplished, Blake reported to his official channels, using predetermined codes that would confirm the operation's success without revealing any details. Package recovered, intelligence obtained, no complications. Once they reached safe waters, Phoenix began transferring her intelligence to Rachel's secure systems. The information she had gathered painted a disturbing picture of a sophisticated network that had been specifically targeting independent assets. They have detailed intelligence about our operational patterns, Phoenix reported. Personnel files, mission summaries, even psychological profiles of individual assets. Someone has been providing them with information that should be impossible to obtain. Blake felt the implications settling over him like a cold fog. Internal security breach? Possible, but their intelligence appears to come from multiple sources. They may have developed systematic methods for identifying independent assets, rather than relying on leaked information. Rachel studied the intelligence data with obvious concern. This changes everything about how we operate. If they can identify assets systematically, nowhere is safe for independent operations. Blake reviewed the personnel files Phoenix had obtained. These profiles are too detailed to have been developed through external observation. They know things about asset backgrounds, training, and capabilities that suggest access to classified personnel records, which means we need to fundamentally reconsider operational security for the entire program, Rachel concluded. This intelligence will need to be shared with everyone involved in independent asset operations. Phoenix looked up from her analysis. There's something else. They weren't just planning to interrogate me. They were preparing to use me as bait to capture other assets. My extraction may have prevented a much larger compromise. Blake understood the broader implications. They're not just hunting individual assets. They're planning to roll up the entire network. Exactly, Rachel confirmed. Which means this operation was about more than extracting Phoenix. We may have disrupted a systematic attack on independent asset operations worldwide. As the Meridian continued toward their debriefing location, Blake reflected on how each mission seemed to reveal new layers of complexity in the shadow world he had entered. What had begun as a simple territorial violation had led him into operations that protected national security interests most people would never know existed. But understanding the scope of the threats they faced also reinforced the importance of the work they were doing. The weapons trafficking network Phoenix had infiltrated would have supplied terrorist groups with the capability to conduct devastating attacks against civilian targets. The intelligence she had gathered would allow them to disrupt similar operations before they could achieve their objectives. "Commander," Rachel said as they approached their destination, "your coordination of official resources made this extraction possible. The network would have detected any conventional military approach, but the cover you provided allowed us to operate effectively." Blake nodded, understanding that their collaboration had created capabilities neither official nor unofficial operations could have achieved independently. What happens next with the intelligence Phoenix gathered? It gets analyzed, sanitized, and distributed through channels that protect our operational methods while ensuring the information reaches people who can act on it. The trafficking network will find their operations disrupted by law enforcement, actions that appear completely unrelated to Phoenix's capture. As they reached safe harbor, Blake realized he was no longer thinking of these operations as separate from his official duties. The work they were doing served the same ultimate objectives as conventional military service, protecting American interests and saving lives, but through methods that required operating outside normal channels. The device Rachel had given him months ago had become more than just emergency communication protocols. It represented access to a parallel structure of service that complemented official operations while maintaining the independence necessary to operate in spaces where conventional forces couldn't function effectively. 2 weeks after Phoenix's extraction, Blake received an encrypted message that changed everything he thought he understood about the situation they were facing. The communication came through channels that bypassed all official intelligence systems, using protocols that only a handful of people had access to worldwide. "Commander Blake, this is Admiral Crawford. You are ordered to report immediately to classified facility designation Omega-7 for emergency briefing. Come prepared for extended operations. The situation has escalated beyond current operational parameters." Blake had never heard of Omega-7, but the authentication codes were genuine and the priority level indicated a national security crisis. He gathered his operational gear and activated emergency protocols that would remove him from all official schedules without creating security concerns. The facility turned out to be located in an area that didn't appear on any standard maps, accessible only through a series of checkpoints that required biometric authentication and security clearances he didn't know he possessed. The buildings were unmarked, designed to appear like typical government office complexes while concealing sophisticated security systems and communication equipment. Admiral Crawford met him personally at the main entrance, her expression grim, with stress that suggested she hadn't slept in days. "Commander, we have a crisis that threatens the entire independent asset program." Phoenix's intelligence about the weapons trafficking network was only the beginning. She led him through corridors that required multiple levels of security clearance, past offices where analysts were working around the clock on problems Blake could only guess at. The emergency operations center they entered was filled with screens, displaying global intelligence feeds, communication intercepts, and surveillance data from dozens of sources. In the past 72 hours, Crawford began without preamble. 3 more independent assets have gone missing under circumstances that suggest systematic targeting. The network Phoenix identified has been more successful than we initially understood. Blake studied the tactical displays showing the locations where assets had disappeared. Coordinated operations across multiple theaters? Exactly. They're not hunting assets individually anymore. They've developed systematic methods for identifying and capturing our most valuable people simultaneously. Director Cross emerged from a secure communication booth, his expression carrying the weight of impossible decisions. "Commander, Nightingale has gone dark while investigating one of the missing asset locations." Her last transmission indicated she had identified the central coordination point for the hostile network. Blake felt the bottom drop out of his understanding of the situation. "When did we lose contact?" 18 hours ago. Her emergency protocols haven't activated, which suggests either complete systems failure or deliberate suppression of her communication capabilities. Crawford activated additional displays showing Rachel's last known operational area. She was investigating a facility in international waters that appeared to be coordinating the systematic targeting of independent assets. Intelligence suggested it was the command center for the entire network. Blake studied the location, recognizing the tactical challenges involved in any rescue operation. A facility in international waters would be heavily defended and positioned to make conventional military approach nearly impossible. Exactly why we need someone with your experience coordinating between official and unofficial capabilities, Cross acknowledged. This situation requires resources from both sides of our operations. Crawford pulled up classified files that revealed the true scope of what they were facing. The network Phoenix identified isn't just trafficking weapons. They're conducting a systematic intelligence operation designed to neutralize America's independent asset capabilities. Blake reviewed the intelligence data, noting the sophistication of the hostile network's organization. State-sponsored? Multiple state sponsors, coordinating through private contractors to maintain deniability. They've identified independent assets as a critical vulnerability in American intelligence operations and developed systematic methods for eliminating that capability. Cross activated secure communication systems that connected to intelligence agencies worldwide. 4 allied nations have reported similar attacks on their independent intelligence capabilities. This is a coordinated assault on informal intelligence networks globally. Blake understood the implications. If they succeed in neutralizing independent assets systematically, entire categories of intelligence gathering become impossible. Exactly, Crawford confirmed. Operations that can't be conducted through official channels. Intelligence that can't be gathered by conventional means. Crises that can't be resolved through diplomatic processes. All of that capability disappears. Cross handed Blake a secure tablet containing operational parameters for what appeared to be an impossible mission. "We need you to coordinate a rescue operation that recovers Nightingale and disrupts the command facility coordinating attacks on independent assets worldwide." Blake reviewed the mission parameters, noting how many elements would have to function perfectly for success. "Sir, this operation requires coordination between multiple naval forces, intelligence agencies from allied nations, and independent assets who may not trust official channels. Which is exactly why you're the only person who can coordinate it effectively," Crawford replied. "Your experience working with Nightingale gives you credibility with independent assets. Your position in the Phantom Division provides access to official resources. And your understanding of both operational environments allows you to bridge gaps that have never been bridged before." Cross-activated displays showing the tactical situation around the hostile facility. The command center is positioned on a converted oil platform in international waters, heavily defended, with sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities and personnel that include former military specialists from multiple nations. Blake studied the defensive arrangements, noting the challenges they presented. Direct military assault would trigger international incidents with multiple nations. Covert infiltration would be nearly impossible given their security measures. Unless, Crawford said, we create sufficient chaos to force them to divide their attention while a small team conducts the actual rescue operation. The plan they outlined required coordination between resources Blake had never imagined could work together. Naval forces from 3 allied nations would conduct what appeared to be routine maritime security operations in the region, creating pressure that would force the hostile facility to focus on external threats. Meanwhile, remaining independent assets would coordinate diversionary operations that would draw security personnel away from the central facility. "Phoenix will lead the diversionary team," Cross explained. "Her experience with their operational methods makes her uniquely qualified to create believable threats that will force them to respond predictably." Blake studied the complex operational timeline. "And Nightingale's rescue? That's where your unique capabilities become critical," Crawford replied. "You'll coordinate official intelligence support while conducting the direct rescue operation, using resources that officially don't exist." Blake understood what they were asking him to do. "I'll be operating completely outside official channels while using official resources to support the mission." "Exactly. If the operation succeeds, you'll be credited with coordinating a successful intelligence operation. If it fails, you'll be investigating maritime security violations on personal time that went tragically wrong." Cross activated additional screens showing real-time intelligence about the hostile facility. "Commander, there's something else you need to understand. Nightingale isn't just being held as a prisoner. Intelligence suggests they're using her knowledge of independent asset operations to target remaining assets systematically." Blake felt anger building as he absorbed the implications. They're forcing her to compromise the entire network. Or they're trying to. Rachel Winters has never broken under interrogation, but they have resources and techniques that have never been applied to someone with her level of knowledge. Crawford handed him encrypted communication devices that would allow coordination with assets and agencies around the world. "Commander, this operation determines whether independent intelligence capabilities survive or whether entire categories of national security operations become impossible." Blake accepted the devices, understanding the weight of responsibility being placed on him. "When do we begin?" "Immediately. Naval forces are already positioning for what will appear to be routine maritime security exercises. Independent assets are moving to staging areas for diversionary operations. You have 6 hours to reach the operational area and coordinate the final phase." As Blake prepared for departure, Cross provided him with intelligence updates that painted an increasingly urgent picture. "2 more assets have gone dark while we've been planning this operation. The systematic targeting is accelerating." Blake boarded a high-speed transport that would take him to the operational area, reviewing mission parameters while monitoring global intelligence feeds. The scope of what they were attempting was beyond anything he had imagined when he first encountered Rachel in the South China Sea, but he also understood that the work they were doing, the shadow operations that protected lives and preserved freedoms most people never knew were threatened, represented a form of service that was too important to abandon without a fight. The transport reached the operational area just as the final phase of the mission began to unfold. Multiple naval forces were conducting exercises that appeared routine, but which collectively created a web of surveillance and pressure around the hostile facility. Blake could see the converted oil platform in the distance, its defensive arrangements clearly visible even from their safe observation distance. Phoenix team is in position for diversionary operations, came the report through secure channels. Independent assets standing by for coordinated action. Blake activated his communication systems and began the complex process of coordinating between official and unofficial resources. All elements. This is Phantom Command. Execute operational plan in sequence. Maintain communication discipline and be prepared for adaptive response to changing conditions. The diversionary operations began with precision that demonstrated the level of training independent assets received. Apparent mechanical failures in cargo vessels near the hostile facility forced them to activate emergency response procedures. Suspicious maritime activity in multiple directions required security personnel to investigate potential threats. Communication intercepts suggested coordinated surveillance from unknown sources. Hostile facility is responding to diversionary pressure, Blake reported, monitoring their reactions through official intelligence channels. Security personnel deploying to investigate external threats, but something was wrong. The facility's responses were too organized, too prepared for the specific diversions being conducted. Blake watched with growing alarm as their carefully planned operation began to unravel. Phoenix team, abort diversionary operations immediately, he ordered. They were expecting our approach. This is a trap. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The hostile network hadn't just captured Rachel. They were using her knowledge to set up an operation that would capture or eliminate the remaining independent assets in a single coordinated strike. All elements, emergency extraction protocols, Blake commanded. The operation is compromised. They're using Nightingale's knowledge against us. But even as he issued the warning, Blake realized there was still one option available. The trap. They had walked in to assume the rescue operation would follow conventional patterns. If he could adapt to use resources they hadn't anticipated, there might still be a chance to recover Rachel and disrupt their systematic targeting of independent assets. Phoenix, maintain communication silence and execute emergency protocols. He ordered. I'm adapting the operation to conditions they haven't prepared for. Blake activated emergency authorization codes that he had never expected to use, requesting direct support from military assets that officially couldn't be involved in intelligence operations. The risks were enormous if he was wrong. The political consequences would be devastating. But if he was right, it might be the only way to save Rachel and preserve the independent asset program. This is Phantom Command requesting immediate support under national security emergency protocols. He transmitted to naval forces in the area. American intelligence asset in immediate danger. Authorization for direct intervention approved at highest levels. The response came within minutes. Phantom Command, this is Admiral Martinez aboard USS Constellation. We are moving to support your operation. What do you need? Blake had never felt more alone or more responsible for consequences he couldn't fully predict. But he also understood that some situations required people to make decisions without perfect information, to take calculated risks in service of objectives larger than their own safety. Admiral, I need you to trust me and follow my lead. We're going to recover our people and end this threat to American intelligence operations permanently. The USS Constellation's appearance on the horizon changed everything about the tactical situation. Blake watched through advanced optics as the hostile facility's personnel reacted to the sudden presence of an American naval vessel with confusion and growing alarm. Their carefully orchestrated trap had been designed to capture independent assets using covert methods. They weren't prepared for direct military intervention. "Admiral Martinez, this is Phantom Command," Blake transmitted on secure channels. "Request permission to coordinate rescue operation with your support. Permission granted, Commander. We're prepared to provide whatever assistance you need to recover American personnel." Blake activated his communication systems to coordinate with Phoenix and the surviving independent assets. "All elements, the situation has changed. We now have official military support for asset recovery. Adapt your positions to support direct rescue operation." From his command position aboard a specialized surveillance vessel, Blake could see the hostile facility's defensive preparations being rapidly reorganized. Personnel who had been positioned to capture independent assets were now scrambling to defend against conventional military threats they hadn't anticipated. "Phoenix team, initiate diversionary operations now," Blake ordered. "Draw their attention away from the central facility while naval forces approach from the primary direction." The coordinated operation that followed demonstrated what could be accomplished when official and unofficial capabilities worked together seamlessly. The Constellation's presence forced the hostile facility to focus on external threats while independent assets created confusion and misdirection that divided their defensive capabilities. Blake monitored the approach through multiple intelligence feeds, watching as naval personnel prepared for boarding operations while independent assets maintained pressure on the facility's perimeter defenses. The combination of resources created tactical advantages that neither side could have achieved independently. "Boarding teams are ready for insertion," Admiral Martinez reported. "We have visual confirmation of defensive positions and personnel distribution." Blake reviewed the intelligence data one final time before committing to the rescue operation. "Admiral, execute boarding operation with support from diversionary teams. Primary objective is recovery of captured American intelligence personnel. Secondary objective is securing intelligence materials that document systematic targeting of our assets." The boarding operation proceeded with military precision enhanced by intelligence that only independent assets could have provided. Within minutes, naval personnel had secured key areas of the facility, while Phoenix's team eliminated external threats that could have complicated the rescue. Blake monitored communications intercepts as the hostile network's coordination began to collapse under pressure they hadn't prepared for. "Multiple facilities are going dark as their command structure fails," he reported to Admiral Martinez. "The systematic targeting operation is being disrupted globally." "Excellent, Commander. Our teams have located captured personnel and are beginning extraction procedures." Blake felt relief wash over him as reports confirmed that Rachel had been found alive, though her condition indicated she had endured significant interrogation pressure. "Nightingale's status? Conscious and coherent. She's being treated for minor injuries, but appears to have maintained operational security despite extended interrogation." Phoenix's voice came through secure channels. "Phantom Command, we've secured the facility's intelligence archives. The material here documents systematic targeting of independent assets from multiple nations. This operation was much larger than we initially assessed." Blake coordinated the extraction of personnel and intelligence materials, while monitoring global communications for reactions to their operation. "All teams, prepare for immediate departure. We need to clear the operational area before other actors can respond to what we've accomplished here." The withdrawal proceeded as smoothly as the insertion. with the constellation providing cover while independent assets disappeared back into the shadow networks they operated within. Blake found himself alone with Rachel as they transferred to a secure medical facility for debriefing and recovery. "Commander," Rachel said, her voice carrying exhaustion but also satisfaction, "your coordination made this rescue possible. The network that captured me had prepared for every conventional response except direct military intervention supported by independent assets." Blake studied her condition, noting that despite obvious stress, she had maintained the mental clarity that made her so effective in crisis situations. Did they compromise operational security for other assets? They tried, Rachel acknowledged. But the interrogation techniques they used were designed for conventional intelligence personnel. They weren't prepared for someone with my level of resistance training. Blake felt relief that went beyond their immediate success. What happens to the intelligence we recovered? It gets analyzed and distributed through channels that will allow multiple nations to protect their independent intelligence capabilities. The systematic targeting operation has been disrupted, but the threat hasn't been eliminated completely. Rachel activated secure communication systems to coordinate with assets and agencies worldwide. This operation demonstrated that official and unofficial capabilities can work together more effectively than anyone had believed possible. Your role as coordinator created new possibilities for protecting national security interests. Blake reflected on how much his understanding had evolved since that first encounter in the South China Sea. What had seemed like a simple territorial violation had led him into a world where the most important victories were achieved by people whose names would never appear in official records. "Nightingale," he said, using her operational designation, "what comes next for independent asset operations?" Rachel considered the question while reviewing intelligence reports about global reactions to their operation. "We adapt. The threats we face evolve constantly, so our methods must evolve as well. But the fundamental mission remains the same: protecting lives and preserving freedoms through operations that can't be conducted through official channels." She turned to face him directly. "Commander, your performance during this crisis has demonstrated capabilities that make you uniquely valuable for coordinating between official and unofficial operations. Director Cross has recommended you for permanent assignment as liaison between the Phantom Division and independent assets globally." Blake understood the significance of what she was offering. A position that officially doesn't exist, coordinating operations that officially don't happen. Exactly. But operations that protect American interests and save lives that most people will never know were threatened. Blake accepted the assignment without hesitation, understanding that some forms of service were too important to require public recognition. The work they were doing, the shadow operations that preserved freedoms most people took for granted, represented a calling that transcended conventional definitions of military duty. 3 months later, Blake stood in his new office overlooking a secure compound that didn't appear on any official maps. The walls were covered with monitoring systems that tracked global intelligence operations, secure communication networks that connected him with assets and agencies worldwide, and analysis tools that allowed him to coordinate between resources that had never worked together before. His secure terminal displayed a message from Rachel, who had returned to her independent operations after recovering from her ordeal. "Commander, new intelligence indicates hostile networks are adapting to our enhanced coordination capabilities. Request consultation on operational adjustments." The work continues. Blake smiled as he prepared his response, understanding that each challenge would reveal new complexities in the shadow world he now helped coordinate. But he also understood that the victories they achieved, the disasters prevented, the lives saved, the freedoms preserved, justified every risk they took in service of objectives larger than themselves. The device Rachel had given him during their first encounter, and evolved into a sophisticated communication network that connected official and unofficial capabilities around the world. What had begun as emergency protocols had become the foundation for a new form of service that transcended traditional boundaries between military, intelligence, and diplomatic operations. As Blake reviewed global intelligence feeds and prepared for his next coordination mission, he reflected on the words Rachel had shared during their first meeting. Some serve in the light, others serve in shadow. Both are necessary. Now he understood that the most important service often happened in the spaces between official recognition and public acknowledgement, performed by people who chose duty over credit, mission success over personal advancement and protection of others over protection of themselves. The shadow war would continue, fought by people whose names would never be known, but whose sacrifices preserved the freedom and security that millions of people experienced as normal life. And Blake had found his place in that ongoing struggle, coordinating between worlds that had never worked together before, ensuring that both light and shadow served the same ultimate objectives. Outside his window, the sun set over waters that concealed operations most people would never know existed. But those operations and the people who conducted them stood guard against threats to everything Americans held dear. It was service of the highest order, invisible, unacknowledged, but absolutely essential. Blake activated his secure communication systems and began coordinating the next phase of operations that would protect lives, preserve freedoms, and serve interests larger than any individual recognition. The work continued, as it always had, and always would, in the shadows where the most important battles were fought by the most dedicated warriors. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.